The reason that we talk about product group history and organization is not out of nostalgia or because we like to tell war stories or, it's fun. But it has to do with, very often when you look at an organization, let's take the example of looking at a piece of code. Very often when you look at a piece of code, you say to yourself, well, gee, if I had written this code, I never would have written it this way. And what you don't realize is you're not looking at the piece of code that person wrote originally, right? What you're looking at is the piece of code that person wrote originally, plus all of the additions and corrections and modifications and enhancements and bug fixes that got added into that code. And what you're seeing is the accumulation of all that stuff, right? Well, organizations are like that too. When you look at an organization, you say, gee, I never would have designed it that way. That looks completely screwed up to me. Well, that's also not the way it was probably designed from the beginning. Any organization that exists is the result of some previous organization that has gone through several changes and modifications. And in order to understand your current organization and where you want to get to, the organization you're shooting for, you have to have some sense of history. You have to have some context. Otherwise, it's hard to understand what's going on. So we're going to spend a very short period of time on company history so you can understand how we got to where we are. And hopefully, using that context, you can better understand where we want to get to. Okay? So, I break the history down into 2 decades. Since the company's been in business for 20 years, roughly. There's the decade of the 80s and then the decade of the 90s. So the 80s was basically building credibility and gaining some traction as a company. 20 years ago we said that Rational was in business to solve the software crisis. About a year ago we talked about resolving the software paradox. This gives you an indication of the progress our marketing people have made in 20 years. Okay. Fundamentally, the message gets tweaked, but the fundamental mission has not changed in 20 years. Interestingly enough, everything else about the company has changed, but that mission has not changed. Originally, we were a single product company. We produced an ADA development environment, an IDE, interactive development environment. And it was a hardware and software solution. Dave is one of the last remaining veterans of the hardware group. And we delivered a turnkey system, hardware and software. It was proprietary hardware, proprietary OS, proprietary software. And functionally, the organization was very functional. There were 2 silos. There was development, reporting up to 1 VP, and sales and marketing was in another silo, and that reported up to a VP, and those 2 VPs talk to each other most of the time. And all of this worked fine until around 1990. And at around 1990, we started to go into a different phase of growth, and that required a different structure. So I asked Dave Bernstein to give me a timeline or a slide that showed the 80s, the first 10 years of the company, and this was the slide he gave me. And I said, Dave, but your slide goes up to 1994. And he said, well, I always like to over-deliver. That was his excuse. But basically, what you can see is that if we stopped at 1990, we were a single product company. And I came into the company in about 86, just about when the field, sales, and marketing organization was starting up. But up until 86, basically, it was a development company. Now, in 1991, 2 things happened. One, we made the decision that we had to get out of the hardware business. And so there was a project called Apex to move the Rational environment off the proprietary hardware onto Unix, onto the Unix platform. And that project was done between 1991 and 1993. I was the manager of that project, and that was developed and delivered on time and on budget. About the same time, we started a project called ROSE, which many of you know about. That took a little longer to actually get out in stable form. But basically, as we got into the 90s, we now had two lines of business. We had the interactive development environment business on Unix, and we had ROSE. So we were now a two-product company. Now, once we became a two-product company, we decided to go to a different model. And this was a business unit model. What we did was we'd split up marketing out of sales. So sales no longer had marketing in it. We just had the field sales organization. And we took marketing and divided the product group up into what we call business units. And each business unit had its own development and marketing. So they could completely control that product line. And we had two business units. We had the programming tools business unit, which I ran, and we had the ROSE business unit, which Dave Bernstein ran. And in about 1995, 94, 95, the programming tools business unit accounted for about 80% of the revenues, and ROSE accounted for about 20% of the revenues. So we were still basically an IDE company, but ROSE was definitely the growth path. Now, one of the things about this business unit structure is that it actually served another purpose, which was very useful. And that is that as we got into the early to mid-90s, Mike and Paul made a very fundamental observation. And that was that the software tools business was consolidating. That all the small companies were dying or being absorbed. And that companies had to grow to a certain critical mass, otherwise they were not viable. That was just the business economics of things. And they decided that the best way to deal with this problem was to be an acquirer rather than an acquiree. That it was better to try to move to the top of the food chain as opposed to becoming part of the food chain. So we started to do a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the mid-90s. And the business unit structure turned out to be very convenient for that, because when you acquired or merged with another company, the process was always the same. You took their salespeople and you merged them in with our field sales organization. And then you took the remaining development and marketing people and you made them a business unit. So you could sort of keep them all together geographically, and from a work product point of view, they were just working now on the testing product line, okay? So you had all the testing developers and testing marketeers in one business unit. So this actually worked very well. So here's my slide for the next 10 years, and this is the mirror image of the Dave Bernstein slide, in that I only started in 1994. So I underdeliver. I've only got 7 years in my 10-year slide. And what this slide shows is basically all the acquisitions that we made, what was the technology or the product that we acquired, and it shows the growth. It shows how the company grew in terms of revenue and how it grew in terms of headcount. And what you see is that there's a period here of about 2 years where we basically quadrupled the size of the company. We went from 600 to 2,500 in about 2 years. And having lived through all of this, I can tell you, I'm glad to still be here. This was not easy. I mean, 1997 was a bitch. 1998 was when I had my defibrillator put in. I don't know if there's a correlation there or not, but this was a very, very difficult period to go through, because the size of the company grew so fast, and the breadth of our product line grew tremendously. So, what did all of this lead to? Well, all these mergers and acquisitions led to having more business units. And so by the year 2000, we had grown to approximately 10 business units. Now, I can tell you that 2 business units may not have been enough. But 10 business units was too many, for sure. And we acquired what I call business unit disease, which was the answer to every problem was create a new business unit. So we decided to do suites. Well, that was simple, just create a suites business unit. Well, that created problems of its own because the suites depended on integrating products from all the other business units. So they sort of saw themselves as first among equals, something that some of the other business units didn't exactly agree with. We decided at one point that having marketing in all these different business units was fine, but we weren't doing a good job of corporate marketing, brand marketing, name identification. So we really needed to have a centralized marketing organization. And so the answer was to create a marketing business unit, which was really strange because the idea was a business unit had development and marketing. And now we had a marketing-only business unit. So it started to become very unwieldy. And the basic problem is there was too much coordination, lots of overlap. Too many moving parts. And there was another problem, and that is the product was moving in a different direction. When we acquired all these companies, we had all these point products. And we moved, as you saw, to creating suites in about 1999, roughly. 1998, 1999. And we're now moving even further in that direction to something called One Dance Card, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So the product line is one of convergence. We're trying to move away from lots and lots of products to a more unified offering. But organizationally, we're going in the opposite direction, right? And anytime your product architecture, your product line architecture, and your organizational architecture are divergent, you're going to have problems. You can think about this logically, right? You're trying to get products to converge, but the units that are building them are these little duchies, right, that are going to protect their own turf. It's kind of hard to get them to do the right thing. So what you need to do is to converge your product line architecture and your organizational architecture. And so that's what we did. Okay? Last year we basically started to collapse all these business units, and we now have four main groups. We have marketing, we have what we call the team infrastructure products, things like ClearCase, ClearQuest, and the project management tools. And then we have the developer products, that's basically XDE, visual modeling, requirements, test, and then we have Rational Suites. And so this is the way the organization looks today. Actually, this slide is not exactly current because the Pure team is now part of test. So we need to update that slide. But basically this shows you the organization, and it's now basically simplified into four main areas reporting to Eric, Dan, Jim, and you. A few more words on marketing. Marketing has a few really important functions. Needs to create and promote the brand of the company, to have name identification and visibility. We need to have a lot of uniformity in terms of public relations messaging, press releases, trade shows, user conferences. That all needs to be very coherent. And also in terms of product marketing, pricing, and positioning, that also needs to be done so that you don't have inconsistencies in various parts of your product offering. There's another part of marketing which is what I call technical marketing. Now that actually reports centrally, just like the rest of marketing, but the resources are distributed out closer to the developers. And the reason for that is that these are the people who have to support the field with the technical details of the products, how to do feature comparisons between this product and a competitor's product. And so those people, by necessity, need to be close to where the products are developed. So they're distributed throughout the entire development organization.